Welcome to the Snapshot. We are joined by Glenn Jones, principal game designer for Marvel Snap. He is the guy in charge of balance. So when your favorite card got nerfed, that was his fault. He did that specifically to spite you. You know who I'm talking about. Everyone who's a Thanos lover, this is the guy. If you want to direct your vitriol somewhere, at him on Twitter. I know he loves that. No, please don't do any of what I just said. But Glenn Jones, principal game designer for Marvel Snap, the guy whose decisions are most directly impactful to what we do, I think by a pretty large margin, I would suggest. We can get into that later. Welcome to the Snapshot.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Long-time listener, first-time guest.
Yeah, Glenn, I want to sort of set the foundation for our listeners and get a bit of a background and a history of your journey as a card game designer, and maybe even something that predates that. How did you get into card games? Were you a player beforehand? Just sort of give us the lore, the genesis story of Glenn Jones that has now become this sort of enigmatic character over at Second Dinner. I think I mostly know you through Discord posts, right? All of the answers to all of the questions I have in Marvel Snap are somebody asking a question to Discord and a screenshot of the Glenn Jones answer, the sort of the all-knowing person over there at Second Dinner. But let's get that origin story.
Yeah, sure. It's I'll try and do it quick. It gets a little bit lengthy depending on how you want to tell it. But yeah, I started playing card games in middle school, like 6th grade. My first card game was Magic the Gathering, which is a little unusual. Most people kind of find their way to Magic second or third. But back then there weren't a lot of options. Like Magic was the card game. Pokemon wasn't even like a thing yet, really. So I wound up playing other games from Magic, which kind of changed a lot about how I thought about card games, and Magic was kind of like always there. I played Magic, I like to say pseudo competitively. I lost to plenty of relatively famous people, so that was a lot of fun. I played in a few Pro Tours, didn't do very well in any of those. So yeah. And then from there, I played other games also, like at a pretty competitive level. I am the reigning runner-up world champion of the Yu Yu Hakusho collectible card game. So there you go. Yeah.
How many worlds were there? I was about to.
There was one.
Hey, scoreboard, it counts.
Yeah.
Yep. Lost the coin flip. That's how it goes. Yeah, and I played a bunch of card games from there. Like I played the Dragon Ball Z card game. I played Inuyasha, Yu-Gi-Oh. I played Yu-Gi-Oh pretty competitively. I won a fair amount of money playing Yu-Gi-Oh and Magic. There was a like really fertile like cash tournament scene in Florida, which is where I grew up. So I would travel to events, and they would do like Magic Saturday, Yu-Gi-Oh Sunday. So I'd like sleep over and just play both tournaments and do that. From there, I wound up playing also pseudo competitive poker for a little while. That I was better at because I played low stakes, and eventually I kind of hit a crossroads where I was like, am I going to start adding to my resume, or am I going to like move to Vegas and try and get a lot better at this game? And I decided that last course seemed fraught with peril, so I made my parents slightly happier and decided to go into a career in games. I reported on the Star City Games live tournament circuit. That was like my first big job in games, but before that I did freelance content for the World of Warcraft TCG, where I was also a pseudo-competitive player. I finished, I think, top 16 of Worlds twice in that game, but I didn't play in a lot of tournaments because I was covering the vast majority of them. Worlds was like the one that I always played in, basically. So yeah, that was pretty much that. Like from there, I was into Magic with Star City Games. I was there for a few years building up the tournament circuit that still does some that still is in effect today, but the broadcasting and all that has kind of changed pretty substantially, obviously. But from there, I moved into distribution. I worked at Peach State Hobby Distribution, which is a gaming distributor. They supply local game stores with big box retail and stuff like that, or wholesale, I should say. And I didn't like that very much at all. I was not very good at sales for myriad reasons. It was just not a game I was super interested in playing, I guess is the easiest way to describe it. So I wound up deciding to move to Seattle to try and one day get a job at Wizards of the Coast. I knew a lot of people in Seattle, and I thought, I know enough about Magic here. At some point, some job will open up that I can get. I had actually already been rejected for one before I made that decision, but the process of applying for the job was itself interesting enough that it made me kind of really want to pursue it more strongly. And then while I was preparing to move, I actually got called and they hired me for that job because the person they initially had hired, their contract had ended and they decided to take a different role still within the company. So very lucky for me. I like to say I've gotten lucky many, many times in my career. I could chart my career certainly on how much of it was pure fortune versus merit. And it starts being a lot more merit-based later on, I think, but that early stuff, tons of fortune. So
yeah,
that worked out really well. Yeah. And I was on the editing team at Wizards for 2 to 3 years. I think it was about 3 years, working on the Magic card game. I designed on some sets while I was doing that. They kind of let you moonlight on the design team over there. So I did that mostly for Commander sets. And then they spun up a mobile game that was pretty new called Spellslingers. Well, eventually it was called Spellslingers. It was called something else for a super long time. And I really liked the idea of that. It seemed like a big swing. It was the kind of thing where it's like, if it doesn't work out, that's fine. But if it does work out, it might be huge. So that's the kind of place I like to put my bets. So I tried to kind of help the Spellslingers team out and position myself to be like a producer and editor on that team. And my work wound up turning me into a game designer on that team. So from there, I started designing Magic products and Spellslinger sets at the same time, and eventually shifted over to full-time Magic once the Commander kind of audience and Wizards' desire to recognize and build products for that audience really exploded. And I was put in charge of kind of maintaining the integrity of all of those product lines, making sure no one's stepping on each other's toes, like the person who's able to look at all of the sets and keep them and keep track of them. I was colloquially referred to as the Commander during that time, which was a lot of fun. I did that pretty much until I left, so for a few years, and we kind of folded in Universes Beyond, which was a new Magic endeavor to bring in outside IPs and adapt them into Magic cards. And I did very much the same kind of role for that, being kind of like the one design eye over all of those products to make sure they were experimenting in new directions. Not just, that was one of the differences. Like Commander, we kind of had, a unified philosophy of what makes great Commander products and making sure that people don't, maybe push the envelope too much or push it in interesting ways. But for Universes Beyond, it's very new, so we were like, all right, this product's going to try it this way, this one's going to try it this way. Like, let's see how it goes, and make sure we have things that we can measure and things we can refer backwards to. So it was a really interesting time to be at Wizards, and a really cool role. I was uniquely suited to that role as someone who watches way too mumuch television and reads tons of books and comics. So if I didn't know an IP, I knew how to learn it in like inside of 2 weeks. Just a lot of fun. I worked on a lot of IPs that I had really no foreknowledge of, pretty much. Like, I knew who Optimus Prime was, but I didn't know Transformers very deeply. That was like a huge dive I did. I knew like 4 Street Fighter characters, had to do a huge dive on that product.
You're not like a Fortnite
like
guy.
That.
You didn't just naturally know what a Chug Jug was.
No, I learned it all. But one I did know quite well was Lord of the Rings, which I was the set design lead for. And that product released a few months ago, and very proud of that. Kind of, I think, like my magnum opus at Wizards, so to speak. And I've still got products coming out for another 4 years, I guess. So we'll see those as they emerge.
Wow.
I wanted to jump into the Lord of the Rings thing, actually, because that's been like, as far as I understand it, I'm still like a little bit entwined with Magic Twitter. It's been like really well received for the most part in terms of like how it was designed and what it was made for. And then it's also people trying to figure out how the One Ring happened. And as far as I know, this is a Marvel Snap podcast, but I cannot resist asking. So when you got the design for this super incredible iconic card, was it like, we have to make this strong? Like how does the design process work for something like that? And I'm going to tie this into Marvel Snap because there are a lot of iconic characters in Marvel Snap. How do you tie how relatable, how like pop culture relevant, how unique and iconic something is to the design in terms of power? Like if Spider-Man in Marvel Snap wasn't Spider-Man, would it have been a 3/4? But it's Spider-Man, so it's a 3/5. What are the considerations that go into that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do think like my work on Universes Beyond kind of really directly ties into what I do with Snap now, and why I think I was a great candidate for the role with Marvel Snap, because I just already had a ton of experience translating these things in different directions. And yeah, the One Ring, like, in the canon of that story, it's the most powerful thing in the story, which is kind of also awkward because you don't really see it do anything, right? Like so you can tell people like, what's the most powerful object in Middle Earth, and people will be like, oh, it's obviously the One Ring. We all know that. And it's like, cool. What do you think the One Ring does? And they'll be like, it turns some people invisible, and it's really scary. Like that's like, you know, the majority of their understanding of it. And if you go deep in the lore, there are some other powers, but even those are like pretty massive. Like, oh, it can control like other ring bearers. Like, what does that even mean? Like, how does it do that? So yeah, like, one of the things, right? Kind of, like, yeah.
The way I understood it is like it's an amp, and whoever you are, it scales off of you. It's like an exponent.
That is one of the like presiding beliefs, but there isn't a lot that's like canonically isolated. Like, yeah, this is how it works. Here's the blueprints to the One Ring kind of thing. So that was one of the fun things. Was at Wizards we do a thing called hole filling, which is, you know, we'll ask like everyone in the company who wants to participate in such an activity, like, hey, design a card based on like this thing that we have in the set. And for Universes Beyond products, I made sure I was only doing that in specific spots, because obviously you'll get tons of stuff if you just do it for everything. And you'll just lose more time sorting through it than you would by designing it. But the One Ring was one of the things, where I sent it out, you know, a couple of times, and I wound up with, you know, like 45, 60 different cards. Like everyone just has a totally different idea of like what is the most satisfying expression of this card. And for some people, being in-game powerful wasn't part of that expression, right? Like, and also, you know, some people just don't necessarily design to be in-game powerful by nature. So yeah, that was a really complex thing to determine. But ultimately, we decided, yes, we want this to be a strong card. We want it to be one of the strongest cards in the set. If you look through the set and think the One Ring is one of the weaker rares, that doesn't feel right. That feels very wrong. So yeah, we wound up pursuing an artifact that we could stand behind as like, yes, this is super strong. Like, you look at this, you know, it can go into a lot of your decks. It's really exciting and appealing. And yeah, we definitely hit a little high on the target, I would say, but not as high as maybe people think. Like, we want that card to be strong. Like, it's supposed to be good. You're not supposed to think it's not good. Like, that's
so. Like, when you're making a card like that, you're not saying we're designing a card that's going to warp the modern format, but you are saying we're designing a staple.
Yeah, like our approach to Modern, the set was going to be legal in Modern, which is a Magic format for all the Marvel Snap listeners. So it's a big Magic format where everything is, a lot of things are legal, like most of the new, every new content essentially. So our approach to that was really like make things strong, but not like be sure how they would hit in some cases, because if you're too sure, it's probably going to be too strong. We can't really test everything. So we were making a lot of half card shots.
To tie that into Marvel Snap then, right?
Yes.
When you look at the redesign of a card like Spider-Man, who is perhaps the iconic Marvel superhero, like for a certain genre of 90s kid, before the MCU, Spider-Man was the guy. It was Spider-Man and like arguably Wolverine, who were the flagship characters on Marvel. And is there some desire to just be like, look, these cards have to be relevant, or we want them to be relevant? And how does that impact, like, when you're, let's assume a similar process, like you're looking at various designs. Do you, to what degree is, we want this card to be iconic and we want it to be good, but you don't want to hit it too high, right? Obviously, if you made Spider-Man a 3/6, that would be hitting too high, right? And if you made, like, Loki's like the most popular MCU like show right now by a pretty significant margin, I believe. And if you like, frankly, I think you might have hit it too high on him, but that's beside the point, right? Like, you definitely buffed him from 3/4 to 3/5 late in the process, right? Because and how, to what degree is that because he's Loki, and to what degree is that because you think the card needed the power?
Yeah. It's an interesting balance of things, and in some ways it's kind of a slight converse of what you're describing. So you're saying, like, is our motivation because it's popular, we should make it strong? No, that is not our motivation. However, because it's popular, people are going to want to play it, and that means that it should be rewarding to play with. And strength is one of the ways the card can be rewarding to play with. So in that way, strength is the reward for the players who are fans of the card. So taking the example of Spider-Man, like, let's say if we did the exact same Spider-Man rework and he was a 3/2, it's like, okay, well, now people will be very excited to play Spider-Man, and they'll play him once and be like, oh, this is horrible. I don't like that. I love Spider-Man. Why did they do this? So yeah, we don't want that to be the experience, right? So we want to find a target where we're like, this card's fun, it's exciting. When you decide to play it, you get there and you're even more excited about the choice that you just made. Because just getting there and being like, okay, that was an effective Spider-Man, like that's technically what I like to call that, like, you know, an A-. Like, you did very well, but like, you want people to get there and be like even happier than they were when they were on the journey, so to speak. So that's kind of the approach I take to it. And yeah, it's definitely an imprecise science. One of the things, Loki, returning to that card, we did buff Loki relatively late. And one of the reasons was, you know, we have a very small group of people that we can kind of mine for understanding of the card and talk to and, you know, gather opinions on inside of the company. And so among those people, like, it was somewhat mixed. There were people who thought the Loki, super awesome card, super awesome effect, very excited about it. And there were also people who were just like, you know, it's pretty cool. Like, I also like Moon Girl, you know, like that, like that, like that's the, so we have to make sure, like, okay, are we too low? Like, cause we don't know what our internal group is gonna, you know, like, we don't know if we're in the 99th percentile or the like 50th percentile, and like how people distribute within our own company around the card. So we're like, okay, what can we afford to put any strength into it? Like, what are we most concerned about? And we ultimately decided, like, okay, like, I think this one power, like, this effect can be a drawback, like, and it is, like, we see how some Loki decks are getting exploited too, is, you know, like, you put no answers to your stuff in your deck, they can't reliably have access to their own answers. So Loki's not just a clean, like, you know, above rate card. Like, there is both push and pull to that. So that was ultimately, we decided, you know, that's enough of a justification for us to explore 3-5 here. And that is a thing we can always change later. Like, one of the things that's unique about Marvel Snap versus other CCGs is we do take that live balance MOBA approach of, like, you know, something can be strong now, it'll be, maybe we can make it weak later, we can make it strong again later. Like, we can churn things through. You
kind of answered my question, but I was, because you were part of the design team that worked on the One Ring, a very powerful card in Magic right now, and your role in Marvel Snap, I was just going to ask if there was any sort of, you know, differences in the process when designing for a paper game like Magic, when the ramifications of printing something maybe a bit too powerful can be more punishing versus something like Marvel Snap, where it can be adjusted via an OTA, a patch, or something like that. Do you tend to sort of err on the side of pushing design a little bit and toning it back in a game like Marvel Snap?
Yes, I don't like to think of it as pushing. Certainly, we're more willing to release things stronger than weaker than we might be with Magic, which can pan out in different directions. Magic, relatively recently, in the length of time span of games, I guess it was like, you know, 6 years ago or something, like did Fire, where they decided, you know, we're just going to stop making the bad cards and just try and make as many of the cards interesting or strong as we can reasonably do over and over. And that was great for Magic in some ways. Had some damage to Magic in some other ways as they kind of got their feet under them under the new process. And now I think the sets are just like, Magic sets are just awesome right now. I really enjoy them. I mean, granted, huge bias. But with Snap, like, yeah, I don't have to be necessarily as careful, but at the same time, I'm not interested in being cavalier about it. Like, it's not a good look if we're just like releasing cards and then nerfing them like a month later. That's not what we want to do. It just isn't, it's not fun for us. It's not interesting. It's not rewarding for the consumer. Like, I take that relationship pretty seriously. Like, we're not here to just do that over and over. If we were going to do that, we would also just not bother playtesting the cards, really, because we wouldn't need to pay attention to that. But no, we want to try and get as close to the mark as possible. But when we're deciding between, like, you know, should we, you know, air low or air high, we generally are going to probably air towards high if it's reasonable, because we can always correct a card from being too high. And we can always correct a card from being too low as well, but it's very unsatisfying to get a new card and find out it's bad. That's a negative experience. So we want to have that experience as infrequently as possible. Whereas getting a card and finding out it's too good, that can create a negative, like, metagame, but it's not a negative experience. People aren't, you know, like, playing Loki for the first time and being like, man, it's so good, this is so frustrating. Like, no, they're, like, very excited. I mean, even the day
I kind of was like that, actually.
Yeah, but I'm like, speaking of people generally.
What are they doing over here? The first time I saw a collector get that big, I was like, oh god, what are they doing? I was laughing, but I don't know if it was good laughing. I will say, I wanted to jump off that.
I want to say, even for a player like you, like, is your first thought, like, this is a nightmare, or I wish this wasn't happening, or is your first thought, I wonder how I'm going to make that collector smaller, I wonder how I'm going to kill that collector? I'm willing to bet most people are in that latter camp. Like, that's the way it can create excitement.
My first thought with Loki was, oh god, how do I beat this? right? And then once I got past, oh God, how do I beat this? I realized that a lot of the answers for, oh God, how do I beat this are like super linear over the top stuff that I really don't like. And that's when I was like, oh man, oh God, oh God. So like, it was like a two-stage thing, right? I do think it's coming down now for whatever that's worth. I think people have figured out like, okay, look, this is not unbeatable. It's just unbeatable if we were doing everything we used to be doing. Like, there's never been less Shang-Chi's in the meta. There's never been less, basically most of the tech cards in the meta. Like, it's a really remarkable about face here, where like these cards that dominated everything have been entirely recontextualized just by like Loki doing ridiculously unfair stuff back to them. Like a rubber band, I'm rubber, you're glue, everything bounces off me and sticks to you. So you did a little fist pump there. That was the goal?
Yeah, one of the things we talk about, I wouldn't say maybe an explicit goal, but one of the things we talk about Marvel Snap versus other card games is that we like the game the most when it's about doing your own cool thing and measuring it up against your opponent's cool thing and being impressed or excited by whatever happens next, right? Like that's really awesome. We obviously want answer cards to exist, like that's super important to like create dynamism and make some things better than others over time, but at the same time, like that's the coolest thing. Like if the top decks in the metagame are like Sarah versus Zabu, it's like that's not super thrilling gameplay. Like it's interesting, it's definitely tactical and strategic, but that's catering to the audience that plays card games at like a pretty high level of like wanting to kind of trade these blows and like win these lanes by like 2 points and manage priority and all those things. Like the vast majority of our audience is not interested in trying to manage priority on turn 6. Like that's just not a high popularity endeavor for Marvel Snap players, I would say. It's certainly key to playing the game at a very high level, and I think it's skill intensive and rewarding, and I want to continue making cards that reward that, and because it's not going anywhere. Like it's definitely just a key factor in the game. But at the same point, like there was no pressure the other way, right? Like playing the Zabu or the Sarah decks with these tech cards, like what was the pressure against doing that? There was almost none. Right, like you could just play the deck. I mean, kind of, yeah, but like you could just still play the deck and just have a middling range of matchups. And if you're a lot better than your opponent, you can kind of just count on that to get you through. It's sort of like I like to use analogies all the time, but like what if you could just play chess up a pawn? Like that'd be great. Like you'd lose some games, sure, but you're gonna just win the vast majority. If you could play poker and always have king queen offsuit or suited or whatever, that's great. You're gonna win a ton. You might lose sometimes, but you're gonna be very far ahead a lot of the time. And that's kind of how it feels like when a deck like, the Jund type decks, the mid-range decks with a lot of answers tend to be strong, is like when those are strong, the game can sometimes be a little less exciting. Like those super cool moments where somebody makes a living tribunal for like 100 or whatever, that just happens way less. And we want to make sure that we get a little bit of both. We want both things happening at all times.
See, I keep jumping off of this. I just keep going. I that's like a really striking thing, I feel like, right? Because I saw this comparison on Twitter where they talked about the state of the modern format before Modern Masters came out to do, or Modern Horizons came out to do a Magic analogy, right? It was just a bunch of different decks, ships passing in the night, right? Just your thing versus their thing, and then however it matches up. And that format is remembered really fondly by most players, and then really unfondly by like competitive players. And to what degree is that just something that you're explicitly like, look, that's what we do. That's what this game is, right? Like, if you want to play it competitively, that's fine. But we're going to design for people to have fun before anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, that is my ethos for Snap, certainly, is like, I'm out here to try and make the most fun mobile card game in history. Like, that is my mandate. My mandate is not like make the most skill rewarding mobile card game in history. Like maybe we're that anyway, because there aren't a lot of mobile card games, but certainly not mobile first ones. But yeah, like that's what I'm about. That's what makes like ultimately the most players happy. And skill is just going to be a fundamental part of our game. Actually, like that's one of the things about Marvel Snap that I find super interesting is like some of the most skill intensive stuff is really under the surface. Like managing priority is the sort of thing like you either like find that or somebody tells it to you or whatever. Like it's not, a core part of the game. You just understand really early on. Most people play like, a full month before they even really start to think about like which cards are going to reveal first and how that matters. And that's because the Series 1-2 experience is kind of structured to make that matter a little bit less. There are cards like Electra, obviously, where it comes up, but like even Electra is a good example where it's like revealing Electra last on turn 6 isn't super important, right? Like that, it just comes up pretty often. Like when you're playing Electra on turn 6, it's because you're turning off Mojo World or whatever. You don't need to know how reveal order works to understand that card. So yeah, that's what I think is cool about Marvel Snap is it has a lot of places where you can build skill, where you can learn, where you can like play matchups. I like to think of Marvel, like that's the area of Marvel Snap I think is most analogous to chess. It's like chess is highly positional, like figuring out what to do is really based on what's happening, and that's how Marvel Snap works tons. Like putting a card at one location might be great in one game and it might be horrible in another because the position is very slightly different. Like 1 or 2 power can change where you're supposed to play a card to win the game multiple turns later. I think that's really cool.
I just wanted to circle back to sort of the fundamental design of Loki and cost reduction in a game like Marvel Snap. How do you feel about cost reductive cards sort of in the sort of, I don't know, grand scheme of things in the design of Snap? And do you think it's one of the most powerful things that a player can be doing in the game? If not, like, I just want to ask sort of about other card game fundamentals and how they translate to a game like Snap, doing things like drawing cards, location control, opponent discard, asymmetric information, things like Kang and Howard, multi-lane pressure in the sort of in the form of like Doctor Doom. What do you think is like some of the most dangerous, or I don't know, dangerous or volatile areas of design of Marvel Snap, and what are some of the most powerful things that players can be doing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting area to explore, and we're honestly still kind of like learning about it and understanding it better ourselves. A good like the chess example I just used, a fine example of like how positionally things like position obviously is a manifestation of how the cards are actually deployed on the board. And that can just change a lot of things, which isn't true in most card games. Like, where you arrange your battlefield in Magic or whatever doesn't matter very much. Like in Pokemon, it's kind of similar, where like maybe you should put a different person in the front versus in the back for Adventure versus Arena. Like that comes up. So I've been playing a ton of card games even more to like try and understand more about games that have like little pieces of our game or pieces of dynamics that appear in our game in different combinations. So it's been really interesting. Going down the list, like cost reduction is a fascinating one. Cost reduction is very powerful just in principle. It lets you play, more cards than you're supposed to be allowed to play. Like Marvel Snap has a finite amount of energy that you get each game, plus or minus 7, depending on whether somebody plays Magic. So yeah, like that's definitely powerful to be able to manipulate that. At the same time, like it's capped, right? Like if you can't play every card, if you could already play every card you draw, cost reduction is largely irrelevant, minus, something like Sunspot. So it's both very strong and also weak, depending on what you're doing. Loki is a reasonable example in this space. Moon Girl's probably a slightly better one, where it's like very often with Moon Girl, like you're making a bunch of cards, but you're not going to play them all. So is that card advantage? Like, not really. Like Marvel Snap's not about attrition. Like you don't make trades very often in Marvel Snap. You trade placement and power. Like if I'm going to take up a slot for 3 power and you're going to take up a slot for 4 power, that's a trade of sorts, but it's not attrition, right? It's not attrition in the traditional sense that card games use. Like Magic is a game that is largely about attrition in its smaller formats, whereas we have essentially none of it. And then it's a lot more about like linear, very powerful things that like overwhelm whatever your opponent's defense is. And we're closer to that, but at the same time, we don't really, there's nothing that's like truly overwhelming. Like everything can theoretically be beaten if your opponent is going second on turn 6, right? Like there's just in general, given time and agency, like there's not a lot of stuff that's just so far over the top it can't be stopped, in comparison to something like Magic, where you can play like 100 spells and then play a storm spell that copies it 100 times and your opponent's definitely dead. There's no way they could possibly beat that, right? Like there's nothing like that in Snap.
How do you feel?
So that's the kind of thing.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to return to your list. Like it's also contextual, right? Like making your opponent discard 1 card, is that super strong? I don't know. If it's making them discard like their highest cost cards, like, okay, well, that's really strong against some people, really bad against other people. But then it's like, make them discard 3 cards. Okay, that's strong against everybody. Nobody, and it's not fun. Nobody's going to enjoy that. So how do we structure around making that available? Because right now, it is possible to discard 3 of your opponent's cards in Snap, right? Like you can play Moon Knight into Silver Samurai into Black Bolt. Boom, you got them. Toss in a Spider Ham somewhere along the road to like maybe make it feel similar. that's like, we don't want that to happen a lot. Obviously, we know that people don't really enjoy that, but we do want, at the same time, there are people who enjoy doing it, who are excited by the prospect of it. So how do we balance it out for them?
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about zero-sum fun and cards like Galactus, and how important is interactivity between players in a game like Marvel Snap?
Yeah, Galactus, I've written a fair amount about Galactus at this point, both internally and externally. But
I'm going to jump in here and let you know that Brendan is a Galactus fan. Just letting you know the audience here. Fan. Okay.
I think so. Galactus does two things super well. The first is he demonstrates the incredible possibility space of the game, right? Like, Galactus is the sort of card that you don't even know it might exist until you see it. And you're like, oh my God, like, that is possible. Like, that's a thing that happens. Like, those kinds of cards are awesome. Love making them. I think every card game needs to do stuff like that, where your audience just is blown away by what you figured out to do. It can't all just be like, put these numbers together in a pleasing formula and do something slightly interesting. Like, no, you need some stuff that really blows people out of the water. So Galactus does that in an awesome way. He also reprioritizes, like, what's important in a game. Similarly, that's cool. Like I talked about earlier, we don't want tech cards, like, necessarily always being the best thing to be building your whole deck around. Galactus is very much in that boat. Like, he's like, hey, no, like we're not going to care about that this game. We're going to care about something different. We're going to care about who has the biggest stuff in one location. So he does those two things really well, and those are both positive things to have around. What he did too well was he made the player feel like they weren't playing the game they had decided to click on their phone, right? Like, they're like, I want to play Marvel Snap, I'll click this. And then they're like, okay, well, I feel like I'm playing like this weird version of War now, and it's not Marvel Snap. And that's totally fair. Like, if I was playing War and my opponent's deck was all kings and aces, I would be like, this game sucks, I don't want to play that. So yeah, I totally get that. And we ultimately, we want both, right? Galactus was doing all these two good things for us that are powerful. And the recontextualizing what's strong in the game and making it less like Marvel Snap, those are kind of tied up together. Like, that's how that one works, is it makes the game less like Snap. So we don't want to throw it away. Plus, we have people like Brennan who are fans of Galactus. We don't want to just throw the card away to do a totally different design. Like, that's not going to make anyone, including us, happy. Like, we want to try and find what was exciting about the fantasy of the card and keep it intact. And that was ultimately what we sought to do with that rework. And largely that rework hit all of our goals for it. The card's like still actually a winning card, but it's a narrow margin. It has polarizing matchups. It's less popular. Like, all of those things added up pretty well, I think. I'm pretty happy
whoever
with
pitched that redesign. Like, I think whoever came up with that one is like an absolute genius. I'm going to be honest with you. Because I came to the same conclusions that you're talking about here. If you go back and listen to the Snapshot, which I guess you might actually have done, like, you basically listed out a lot of the things we were saying, which is like, a lot of the counters aren't counters, and also it relies on them being in your deck. And once Arrow wasn't everywhere anymore, after she got nerfed, everyone didn't have the free Galactus counter in their deck, and you actually had to pay a deck building cost if you wanted to respect this card at all, right? And changing his condition to what you changed it to, like, I would not have come up with it in a million years. Like, I genuinely consider that a work of, it's the best balance you guys have ever done. That is the single best change that you have put into the game, in my opinion, where you keep what is good about Galactus, but you give every deck, a fundamental way to interact with them. And that is so key. It is like head and shoulders above, in my opinion, basically every other balance change you've made, because a card like Galactus, you're right, you can't delete it. You can't just like make it terrible. It's cool. It's really cool, but it's also really dangerous. And part of the reason why it was really dangerous is it was hard to interact with. So you added a dimension where the thing every deck does naturally interacts with it. And I think that one deserves kudos. I don't think you guys get enough praise for how good that Galactus one was. I've disagreed with balance decisions before, but that Galactus one was by far my favorite.
I appreciate that. The one of the things that did kind of has been a focus of mine as I started here at Marvel Snap was some of the cards that were coming out were not didn't have robust balance knobs, I would say. The Galactus is a prime example, right? Like, how do you tune Galactus? It's like the original one. Like, okay, well, you can make him lower power, but now Shang-Chi's much worse against him. He's actually better.
It's actually a
one
buff.
of the tech cards.
Yeah.
You can make him higher power, but now he's much more likely to beat the people who don't draw Shang-Chi. Like, if he was just the same card as before, but 10 power, it's like, so what's the number, right? Like, there's got to be, there's a number that exists, I'm sure, but it's probably some super weird number, like -11 or something. Or and I don't have the time to find that number, like, because it's just not worth it. So yeah, like a lot of it was figuring out, okay, Galactus has essentially one knob, because we could theoretically change energy, but we don't really want to. So how do we actually like make that a knob? And so that was, we figured out a design that does that. We tried a bunch of weird stuff that definitely a lot of it was terrible and did not work. But that was the one that we kind of kept coming back to. Was like, we really need to make it so that we can, like, if we miss, we can just change the power and we'll hit. Like that's the most successful possible rework, is making him OTA-able.
I also think that, like, when you think about the things the community was pitching at the time, the stuff the community was pitching was all this, like, make him just say you can only play him on turn 6, or like just stuff that sucks. I don't really know a better word to say it. Like stuff that is A, complex, and B, feels bad, where it's just like not actually, like, it solves the problem in the most straightforward brute force way. And that's what I like about the redesign, which is it's elegant. It just works.
Yeah.
There's no weird magic text on it.
So we definitely, like, every now and then, like, I don't usually go, like, trolling for ideas from the community, but obviously I see tons of them. And even when I don't agree with, like, the direction for a lot of those designs, such as with Galactus, like, one of the things that seeing those kinds of ideas is really helpful in is it tells us what the unpleasantness is for people. Like, when someone suggests a design, like, even if it's a very flawed design, it will often communicate what they find distasteful about the card.
You can reverse engineer it.
That gives us, data points for, like, okay, what, if we were to implement this fix, this person would still be upset. Like, is there some fix that solves both? Like, that's the kind of thing that I find myself thinking about. And also, like, you speak to elegance. That's something I prioritize a lot. Like snap cards, we want them to be relatively clean reads. So when we can solve multiple problems with one problem, that's great, because we really only have, or one solve, I should say. That's really only all we can put on the card, really. Like one or two things is all we get to fit.
Yeah, what I loved about Galactus, and what I still like about Galactus, is that it changes the paradigm of Marvel Snap, which was actually the detriment of the card, like you talked about. The opponent would queue up the game, and they would not get what they signed up for. But I do think it's very refreshing to have cards exist in the game, for where I can transition from, maybe my traditional point slam deck, or a deck that's competing strictly on points in all 3 lanes, and find a card that will actually just change the somewhat win condition of the game. And I think that Galactus was a good reflection of that, and still is. There's also other ways to change the paradigm of the game, right? Like, I think Loki kind of does that. It's the concept of a card that plays your opponent's cards. Like, I think these cards add a lot of replayability into Marvel Snap, and you can have sort of a respite from maybe more traditional decks, or usually what are the best decks in the meta, which are either the sort of responsive tech card decks or the point slime decks. So I don't know. That's why I like the card personally.
Yeah, I think it serves that role well, and I like to make cards that do that, for sure. That shift a little bit and make people think, oh, this deck I maybe thought wasn't good is good. Like, people making rank 1 with Cerebro 3 last week is like a huge win for my team, right? Like, that's awesome. How could that not be awesome?
What of your work are you most proud of in Marvel Snap? Is there like a specific thing where you're like, oh, I nailed that, I crushed that, I knocked that out of the park? Is there something you're feeling proud of right now?
I mean, I'm proud of a lot of things. I think it's kind of gauche to claim credit for a lot of the stuff that goes public facing. You
nailed that. The team nailed that.
There are things I'm proud of that I don't find gauche to claim credit for, which is like, I came in, I came from Magic, a company that knows exactly how kind of to take something from 0 to a printed card, and being able to kind of like adjust and build our design pipeline and create better handoff structures, and just make that process not only more efficient for design, but also like better for the teams that we intersect with. Just on Friday, like, I'm writing out a VFX report for our VFX team. Like, this is what design is trying to capture with each of these cards. This is how, some ideas for how we might capture it. Like, that's that kind of documentation and making that part of the system. Like, that's something I did add, and I'm really proud of doing that. And I love to just make other people's lives easier in a company. One of the things I've always done is, you know, played around in other people's roles a little bit, like enough to know what's going on. I did that at Magic. Like that's how I became a designer, right? Like I tried design a little bit while I was an editor. And I did that with all kinds of other jobs. You know, like I talked to art directors all the time. I would participate in top lining meetings. I wrote flavor text for cards. Like I did all of these things to give me like more insight into what different teams need, what makes them work better. And now I'm getting to like kind of bring that to bear for Marvel Snap, which is an ongoing process that will, you know, take years, if ever, to complete. But yeah, that's the thing I actually am like legitimately most proud of. I mean, yeah, things like Spider-Man and Galactus or whatever are like cool. But I'm not. Those aren't like those aren't the feathers that I'll like remember, you know, like 10 years from now or whatever. Like that's not the thing that I'll hold as valuable.
Right, because it's not your day to day. Our day to day is the cards.
Yes,
your day to
exactly.
day is your process, right? Like it's a very different thing. Your day to day is the people you work with, the process, and all of that. So yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I don't remember. I used to write a lot. I don't remember the best piece I ever wrote. Like I would have absolutely no idea. I just remember when I had a good day and a bad day, and the only measurement of that I have is how I felt about it. Like, so I totally understand why that answer is not like, yeah, we totally nailed the Forge buff. Like, I get it. I did want to ask though. Normally, I get the sense you guys sort of back balance, which is to say you release something in a state and then you're like, we got to adjust that. Let's use our OTA in order to adjust that. With the recent change to Thanos, I have a conspiracy theory that you were front balancing in the sense that you were getting rid of, like, tuning Thanos down to avoid, you know, turn 4 Prophex, turn 5 Dino, turn 6 Eliath deck for any amount of time. Sure. Is my conspiracy theory off base here, or?
Yeah, that's pretty off base. I don't actually try and front balance too much. There are some cases where it's like real obvious. A good example, I guess, would be like Wave. We changed Wave before High Evolutionary came out because I called it the Mighty Green Giant deck, like where it was just all of the cost reduced green people basically. Was just like not super fun to play against at all. Very powerful. So like, yeah, I was like, you know, I want to make this change. Also, like Wave, as discussed in the change, was just like, how do we make more deaths if Wave exists? Because eventually you just build a deck that's like all of the deaths and like 3 enablers for each one or whatever, and Moon Girl or what. And that's just the whole deck and the whole metagame, and it's not super interesting. So yeah, like there are cases where it's obvious that we need to do it, and we do that. But generally, like trying to predict like the strongest specific deck, that you're gonna miss so often relative to how you hit that it's not really worth the effort. Like the deck you're describing, maybe that deck would have been awesome, maybe it'll still be awesome. I don't know. I don't have the exhaustive enough testing resources to determine with like a high degree of confidence either way. So that was not a component of that change. That change was twofold. The first was Thanos at the time that we decided to make it was doing really well. And it was back to like the Professor X lockdown style of Thanos. And that was specifically the one we liked the least. It's okay to have it around, but whenever like Professor X is in your best performing deck, it's like, okay, like how do we want to change that? Because that's probably not ideal.
Yeah.
So we approached it from that angle. And also like Thanos is in this space where just the raw versatility of the kit is not the same as Wave, but is like a future facing ongoing issue where like every now and then you're just going to do something and Thanos is just going to be the best place to do it because Thanos has all of these tools. So we're like, you know, the kit has been proven to be really strong over and over. Like we've seen that exact dynamic happen where something comes out and Thanos is the best deck for a week or whatever, and then it maybe subsides, maybe it doesn't, depending on what happens. So the kit was just looking like, on average, it's a little too strong. So we wanted to shave off a slight amount of power. I know we shaved off. He didn't have a lot of easy places to shave. But that, you know, we did actually, you know, look at the data, like what was the strongest performing stone? Like how often do you win when you draw stone N or whatever? Soulstone's like crushing the other stones. Like it's not close.
It's the safest. So, it's because it's the least conditional one, right? Like that's the one that you're always comfortable playing, right? You don't want to, you're not like, oh, I need to save this reality stone. Oh, I need to save this space stone. Oh, this time stone's on turn 3. But Soulstone you could always play, and now you can't always play. And you say shave. That's a That's a Sweeney Todd type shave right there.
I wouldn't go that far, but yes, it is a meaningful loss of strength. Like
yes, meaningful. Yeah. It is a big one.
That's interesting.
Like I was surprised to see it because like the deck just needs to run downhill, and more roadblocks are really tough to that.
It's also going to teach us something too. So
was the data point? Was the data point on draw or play on the on that stone? Was it on?
It was on draw. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering because
we generally track win rate when drawn.
Okay, yeah, because I think back to Thanos, and like one of the most iconic things about Thanos is, Mind Stone and Snap, and just the power of that card, especially early. So it's interesting to hear that data point. I want to get your thoughts on cards that break sort of the fundamental tenets of the game, something like Magic that extends the game past turn 6. I understand that that's only one additional turn at this point, and it is somewhat minimal. But how do you feel about sort of that process, breaking those core tenets, extending the game past its sort of its barrier of time, and how far can we expect to keep pushing that level of design in Marvel Snap, keep sort of breaking this like core gameplay loop that exists with all of the cards in Snap except for this one card?
Yeah, I don't think you should expect to see the game last until turn 8 anytime soon. But Magic is in the same space of Galactus, I think, where it's just like, oh, like this can happen. Like it's the sort of thing you just didn't imagine necessarily would happen until you see it. And I think that that's obviously, I've said that I think that's awesome when it happens. It opens up the place for like different decks to compete in different ways. It has this kind of like cross functionality with Electro versus like Jubilee or something, where it lets you like kind of cheat, kind of not cheat. Like you do have to, you have to pay for what you bought from the store, but at the same time, you brought more money than you're typically allowed. So that kind of thing. And I think that it's really cool. I like cards where I can kind of implement that, like Wave, Magic, and Electro. All in some ways, you could say they all do the same thing for a certain group of cards, but they all do it totally differently. And I think that that's great. I love it when the design space for an effect can exist and manifest in different ways, where it's correct to play one or none of the other effects, or like which two you pick is kind of interesting. Whether you can build your deck for all three is kind of interesting, like that sort of stuff. So yeah, I really like Magic as a card. I like the more Magics I can make in principle, I think the better. Like I think that's you don't want to make like, a season of Magics. That would be a wild month. But every other month or so, like a card like Magic existing, that's cool if we can hit that that particular line. Like I think that is ultimately very additive to the game.
How do you feel?
I will note,
you're good, Gabe.
There were people in my Discord. Who wanted to compliment you guys on the creation of Loki, which is an extremely powerful card that reads very simply, like no complexity creep, just good card, right? And I think that's sort of the same, something in that vein, where it's just like, this card is a sentence long. It makes perfect sense, and you can immediately see why it's strong. And I just wanted to pass that on. It seemed like the opportune time based on the previous conversation.
How do you feel about the current cadence of OTAs? And talk to me a little bit about the shift from weekly OTAs to the current schedule. And do you think that the current schedule that we're on is the optimal schedule for OTAs in Marvel Snap?
I don't know if it's the optimal schedule. I think we've roughly hit the spot where we kind of have an idea of what's the optimal amount of change, which is somewhere between, like, I think we want meaningful change about twice a month, and I think we want that change to be about 4 to maybe 6 on the high end of cards, generally speaking. Like, could probably go as low as 3, but if we're going to do as low as 3, like, they need to be some pretty meaningful shifts. Like, Dr. Doom up a power would not go in the 3-card OTA. It's good, but not like a huge shakeup. Like Magic down to 3, that would go in a 3-card OTA, right? That's a big shake. So that's kind of the vibe I'm looking for, is like, we want every OTA to kind of create almost that feeling of new content, that players can go out and the game is fresh and exciting and there's more stuff for them to explore again. So that's usually a little bit of column A, a lot of column B when it comes to like big changes and small changes.
Are OTAs primarily driven by internal data on the cards that you buff?
Yeah, we pretty frequently look at what's performing the best, what's performing the worst, and what do we think would be interesting to adjust about the cards doing that. Sometimes we'll look at the best performing deck, sometimes we'll look at the best performing cards, sometimes both, and ditto for the worst. The worst cards are pretty easy to like measure and identify. You know, we just go to an individual card and check it out. Like if an individual card's numbers are terrible, those numbers are going to be terrible in a given deck. Like that's not we don't need to necessarily do a lot of exploration to figure out if the card could be buffed. Like Blade was one such card, where just really weak numbers. We don't need to go dive through every single Blade deck to figure out which specific Blade deck we could make better. We're like, no, this card's just not really working for people. So let's see what we can do. Then on the upper end, it's a little bit more complex, right? Like I can take Darkhawk as an example. You know, like Darkhawk has been sometimes the best card, sometimes the like 15th best card or whatever. Like he bounces around all over the place. So when we look at whether we want to correct that, we do want to dive at the deck, right? Like there are different decks that could play Darkhawk. In general, I think it might be cooler if a new deck is the best Darkhawk deck versus an old deck is the best Darkhawk deck. So that's the kind of direction I'm more interested in changing versus just, is Darkhawk too strong or whatever. Like Darkhawks, there are a bunch of ways to interact with Darkhawk. We're making even more ways to interact with Darkhawk over time. Like the card is generally getting worse, not better, as cards release into the game by virtue of just how we do cards. Not 100% true. Like as soon as we make, you know, like 5 cost, add 3 rocks to your opponent's deck or whatever. All right, we're back on top again. But
when are you gonna make that card, by the way? When are you gonna make Scarlet Witch, but for Subterranea? When are you gonna make that card? When are you gonna do?
I don't know. I wouldn't expect to see that card anytime soon.
The people demand more Subterranea. That's what everyone wants.
So that's the kind of space where, yeah, like when we want to keep a card kind of in the same spot, but we do want to adjust how it's working in the metagame, that's where we will most often dive into what are the decks that use it, why is it strong in those decks, can we add predators to those decks into the metagame? Like that's a thing that can be nice. Like, you know, this isn't a direction we're going to do, so it's easy to explore, but like if I really wanted to make Darkhawk a lot worse, like I'd make Crystal like a 3/4 that draws 2 cards or whatever, right? Like that's going to have a huge impact on Darkhawk. Yeah. So that's the kind of change we could theoretically do if we wanted to attack the card without necessarily nerfing it. And we do make those kinds of changes all the time, where we're, you know, like this card, we don't want to actually make it worse, but we want to make its predator stronger.
I wanted to jump off of you talked about the bad cards, and I want to. This is, I guess, a little bit of a ramble, but I think you'll see where I'm going with it pretty quickly. A card that comes up that people suggest needs a buff to me a ton, like probably more than any other card, is Black Widow. Mm-hmm. And my response to what would you do to buff Black Widow has almost always been, I would not buff Black Widow. I do not want Black Widow to be played more. To what degree are there cards, like when you look at the worst performing cards, there are some that are down there that are just like, okay, Crossbones, Angel. You look at them and they're like, okay, it's very clear why this is bad, but they have the Galactus problem where like a good version of them is either really strong or like really annoying. And like, to what degree are cards like that on your radar, right? Where it's just like, we could buff Black Widow, we could make Black Widow playable, we could make Black Widow really good, but we don't want that to be the prevailing experience of Marvel Snap, right? Like, we could buff Angel, we could say you can't ever draw this card, and then suddenly he's like the best card in the game, right? But you don't want that to be an option. So to what degree are you just like, these cards have to be bad the way they are right now?
If there's a card that has to be bad to exist, that to me is an indication that we should rework that card. Not that we should not buff it. So Black Widow, I get where you're coming from on Black Widow. Like, we don't want Black Widow to be the number 1 strongest, most played card in Marvel Snap or whatever. But I don't think its effect is so frustrating or potentially toxic that it necessarily needs to die. Like, there are, even now with Loki's a good example. Like, if we gave Black Widow an extra power, you know, tomorrow or whatever, how bad would that be for Marvel Snap? Probably not that bad at all. Like, Loki just turns that Widow's Bite into a card. You feel like a buffoon. Move on. So that's the kind of example where I'm like, there are other ways we can kind of mitigate cards like that have risk or have some potential for frustration. And I don't think Black Widow meets the bar of like oh, this is just not going anywhere. A more interesting case to me is Adam Warlock, where it's like, Adam Warlock, how do we make that card stronger? If it's stronger, that's probably bad. Like, we don't want people just drawing an extra card more than once or twice in a game. Like, even once or twice, you should be paying a pretty large cost for it, and that card's not even that bad for the rate you get. Like, if you could consistently draw 2 cards from Adam Warlock, paying 2 energy and 1 slot at a location is a steal for that effect.
Yeah, that's like one of the best cards in the game if you can do that, right? Like, if you if you give him just 1 power, he's cantripping, right? And it's just like, okay.
Yeah. And at the same time, you know, we like, okay, well, let's try giving him 1 power, making him like 3 or 4 energy or something like that so that he can't consistently get it. Well, okay, well, now he's just miserable. He's not actually more fun. He just like works slightly more often, but you feel way worse when he fails. Like, if you play your 2-0 and never draw a card, you're like, all right, you know, I threw away turn 2, not that bad. When you throw away turn 4, you're like, okay, I gotta like delete this card fast. Yeah. So that's the like, Adam Warlock's in a really tricky spot, and we haven't quite decided what we're gonna do there. But like, I think he is a much more interesting example of a card that like has this problem, and it's interesting because his problem isn't that he would be toxic or necessarily, or it's just like there's not he doesn't have great knobs. There's just not a lot of places to go with him that create a fun card. Whereas Black Widow, like, also a great example of a card, like, we could just try making Black Widow stronger, and if it doesn't work out, we can just OTA it right back, right? Like, it's very easy.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the upside of our balanced approach is, like, you know, a month where Black Widow is one of the strongest cards in the game is not theoretically horrible because it is changeable. Like, a game where Black Widow is one of the best cards in the game, that's a different thing, right? Like, yeah, you don't want to be necessarily in that spot. But Black Widow month, that's totally cool. We're happy to have a month where something gets like totally out of whack. The change to Magic was kind of in that space, right? Like, there were like 2 or 3 weeks where like the Marvel Snap metagame was just like, what is happening? This is a totally different place than it was a week ago after the Magic change, and now things have just kind of settled down, and it's not so different.
Well,
until
it was like 2 to 3 days, honestly, because it was like 2 to 3 days of everyone doing ridiculous stuff. And then I was like, wait, I can police this. And then Darkhawk came back in, and it was like, yes, we have answers to this. And then you printed Legion, and it was like, yes, all of these Magics are dead. But no, there's actually still good Magic decks out there. I mean, like Evo, for example, even, God forbid, Hella Tribunal right now is as playable as it's ever been.
Yep, I made Infinite with the Evo. It's funny you bring up the Legion versus Magic thing, because I actually, the most success I had playing with Magic during the Legion era was specifically with these high evolutionary decks, and like playing Magic and then just playing a card on turn 6 to beat them when they thought they were Legioning you out. And you're like, no, you just lose instead. 7 is less than 9. Like,
it's a fun.
Or 8 is less than 9 back then.
Sorry, I got distracted. Angel. What's up with that? Can we do something about that guy?
Angel is on our radar. Honestly, we would have changed Angel a while ago, but we want to retain the VFX, and the fixes that we have require that attention. And we haven't had a lot of VFX downtime. So when we're looking at balance updates, we do triage them based on like what we think would impact the metagame most positively and what is the lowest lift on internal resources, and try and like kind of structure things accordingly. So like the Blade change is a good example of that, where like we could have done that, you know, ages ago, and it's no lift on VFX for us to do. So we just have to decide when we want to slot it in. But Angel is a lift. And also, like, what does Angel do, right? Like, Angel rewards destroy. Do we want to buff Angel like coming right off of Docking season? Like, that's probably not the right time. Like, Destroy's had, you know, a pretty big meal of it for a month. Like, we probably want to give it a little time to let that change, whatever it may be, you know, percolate, and then kind of come back in and create another interesting destroy deck. So that's kind of my approach to that. Like, Angel is on our list of cards like to improve, and we're just, you know, figuring out both the right time from a resourcing standpoint and from a gameplay standpoint.
Glenn, I want to ask you, as a person that's played card games for a long time, has worked on other card games, what do you think about Marvel Snap as a new genre of card games? Short games, small decks, very visual card design, fun and exciting gameplay. Like, the more I play Marvel Snap and the more the game is realized as it starts to mature, the more I ask myself the question of why would you ever go back to these 45, 50-minute games that have instances of uninteractivity? You know, what you ask yourself, what merit does land go add to a game, you know, potentially on turn 1 in a game like Magic? Is Marvel Snap, in your opinion, the future of card games?
It's funny you said, because you're a Flesh and Blood gamer, right?
Yes.
When I was internal at Wizards and that game was coming out, I was very much I was like, why would you want this? Like, isn't this just like what you already had? But oh my gosh, so much more intense in some ways. But yeah, I'm digressing. But yeah, so the genre question is kind of interesting because going to GDC and conventions with game designers, like there's often a lot of attention paid to like, how do we define things? Like, what's the definition of fun? What's the definition of a game? What's the definition of genre? It's like, I find a lot of those discussions kind of pedantic. And it's if you can find a definition that serves your purpose and is useful to you, I think that's great. But I consider those more like design pillars or mission statements. Like, you define it for your game, work under that definition for your game, move on to the next game, maybe you use a new definition there because that's what that game needs. That's kind of my approach to thinking through things. I do think that Marvel Snap distinguishes itself as being possibly the first, but certainly the most successful mobile first CCG, which is design space that had been very secondary. Like, Hearthstone was a huge game. I've personally played like single-digit hours of Hearthstone on my computer versus my phone, but it is not a mobile-first game, right? Like that, it just wasn't. And Marvel Snap is like, that's what a lot of those things that you've highlighted out. Like, it's very flashy. It's got a huge emphasis on art. It's got the 3-minute games, like all of these elements that really speak to being a great experience on mobile. That's not designed explicitly towards the PC, and I think like the PC version is great, but I do think Marvel Snap is more fun on the phone. Like, I play test on my phone at work. I don't play test on my computer because that's the experience I want to have for the game, because I don't want my playtesting data colored by the device that I'm using in a potentially negative direction.
Yeah, so when I talk about the genre thing too, I think that, the reason why I use that word is because I think that Marvel Snap optimized and changed so many things that were somewhat archaic and, I don't know, stagnant in card games, that it's almost at a level to which those card games don't compete with it. Like, Marvel Snap is complementary to other card games rather than cannibalistic, because it is so refreshing, so new, and so streamlined. I don't think there's a question of, do you play Magic or Marvel Snap? It's, you probably play Magic and Marvel Snap, or you're sort of agnostic and you play a single one. Like, I think the game genuinely excelled at fixing pretty much all of the problems that you would associate with a traditional card game.
This sounds pithy, but they fixed it by making it a game you could play on the toilet. I'm like not even joking. Like, there's no joke there. Like, the reason I got into the game was because I was like, oh, dude, this is just all mono red aggro mirrors. They're all 5 minutes and every decision is incredibly intense, right? And that's why I got into it. But like, fundamentally, just a game you can play in 5 minutes, something Hearthstone and Magic cannot guarantee you at all at any time. The simultaneous turns go a long way there, but like legitimately, just it's that good because it's that fast.
When you talk about the complementary aspect, I think that's actually really an interesting thing to hit on, because Magic was designed to be a complementary game way back when. In 1993, the design ethos for Magic was that Richard Garfield was asked, hey, like, people love playing tabletop RPGs like D&D. Could you design a game they can play between sessions? Like something to, pass the time that's in the same genre. And then that's where Magic was essentially kind of born from. And obviously it, far exceeded expectations in that regard. But I think like Snap does do that exact kind of a thing. It is something you can engage in, like, between other activities, other game. Like, you can do it, like while waiting for your turn in a board game. Like, it's a little rude. I wouldn't necessarily advise it, but you can. It's totally possible. I definitely don't do it all the time.
Yes, I play a lot of Marvel Snap.
But you do it sometimes, though. That's an admission.
I do it way more than I should. I'm very
don't play Settlers of Catan with Glenn Jones. Yeah. That's what I've learned here.
Oh, you won't have to worry about playing Settlers with me.
Okay, I'm sure you've heard this, but Marvel Snap is probably one of the most popular games that is played at a physical TCG event. So at US Nationals, the Pro Tour, Worlds, in between rounds, Marvel Snap is a very popular game that people are playing, and I will frequently play it, waiting between matches. Glenn, I want to ask you, because you worked on Spellslingers at Magic. So Spellslingers, theoretically, possibly, I've heard from a rumor, was a response to Magic seeing how successful Hearthstone was. How long do you think it is, and do you consider this before somebody sees the success of Marvel Snap, sees everything you've done to improve upon sort of the original model of card games, and they try to come out or try to sort of mimic the success of Marvel Snap. Is that something that you all are considering? Because my thesis right now is that Marvel Snap genuinely does not compete with any other card game. It has redefined the genre.
It's not, I would say I consider it something that will happen. That's like inevitable. But it's not something I'm like explicitly worried about. I have a pretty laid back approach to game design, I guess, which is, like we're all here, we're all trying to make awesome stuff for our players, doing cool things. When somebody hits upon something really awesome, like they've added to kind of the story of our industry, and that's just like a new thing to do. Like Magic did that, right? Like games have been copying Magic for decades at this point. And that's cool. Like that's Magic's legacy in the genre is essentially how popular it was and how much it was copied and how much it drove design. Like one of the things you might not even realize is how many actual game design studios and games where like the leadership roles in those studios are people who worked on Magic like very early on. It is a ton of people. It is probably an unhealthy number of people relative just to like the diversity of ideas and things that how those things should be shared. Like, but yeah, it's a ton of people. I can't go to a game company and not find somebody there who worked at Wizards at some point. It's almost impossible as far as I know. So yeah, like that's like the legacy of Magic. And if Marvel Snap's legacy is, it changes how mobile games get evaluated, especially like, card battling games, I think for sure, that's where there's a lot of lessons to be learned. But I think it applies in other directions too. Like I work on game ideas in my spare time for myself, and I am influenced directly by Marvel Snap and what I think it does well and what I think maybe it even does poorly or could do better. And that's a lot of that's where I expect in general, the industry is constantly building on itself. Like Baldur's Gate 3 just came out, like the same thing's going to happen there. Yeah. People are seeing the success of this huge game, totally different genre from Snap, totally different audience in many cases from Snap, the play experience, totally, but what happens is the same. People see, people integrate, people evolve, and we get the next most awesome thing years down the road.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about the end game loop of Marvel Snap. So currently consisting mostly of ladder and conquest. You came from Magic. You're aware of the limited format, maybe even a fan of it yourself. Do you think that there is a future of limited in Marvel Snap? It is currently a community fostered format and a beloved one at that for those that play it. Is that a potential in the future for Snap?
It's certainly possible. I can't at risk of I don't want to make people think I'm too certain or too uncertain, I guess. But yeah, I would say it's possible. I do love limited. I think limited has a ton of things that are awesome going for it. Like it's a really great equalizer. People get a level playing field in some sense. It exposes you to cards that you might not own, which can drive excitement to play the game more and engage in other modes, or engage in finding and acquiring that card. It's one of the things I think people, the game designery approach to limited is a story. It's like a 3-act play, essentially. You get your cards, you build and play your deck, and then you get, your story ends when you're either eliminated or you win. Like that's an element of play that people maybe don't appreciate, but I think that is a driving thing about limited. It's one of the reasons I think think about limited events, league, like the capped gameplay of leagues versus, if you played the same draft deck for a month, which is more popular, right? Like it's the capped thing. Like nobody wants to draft their deck and then play it for 30 days. Like that lacks the 3-act story. Like I'm not getting that final chapter, that satisfying conclusion to what I did. So that's just a very minor kind of note on limited game design, I guess. But in general, I like limited a lot. I play it a ton in my spare time with other games. I even really like games that I think have kind of captured the limited experience in different ways, which is something that I'm kind of inspired by. Hearthstone Battlegrounds and Teamfight Tactics are good examples of that, where those games very much feel like limited gameplay, even though they don't have a constructed analog. So the limited moniker kind of doesn't make any sense. But that's what they go for, right? They're trying to contain the experience of you get to, approach this problem, you get dealt some random stuff, you cobble and adapt and figure out what the best thing to do is. And I think that's just in general a really fun thing to do.
And the pick up and play low barrier to entry is it's kind of a mini game of what constructed is, right? Constructed, a lot more domain knowledge required, potentially collection, etc. Speaking of Marvel Snap's constructed format, how do you feel about the current new player experience of Marvel Snap? Do you feel like that Series 1, Series 2 introduction and that initial game loop is in an optimal state? Are you happy with it?
I'm pretty happy with it. We do have a team even right now, I think, that is just reviewing it and seeing like where there might be some potential for improvement. When you talk about like innovations within the genre, I think that's actually one of the ways that underappreciated ways that Marvel Snap is really strong. Like most tutorialized card games, you like get your first deck, you play it for a little bit. Once you know how the game works, you get kind of thrown into the deepish end of the pool, and you need a new deck. Right, like that deck's not going to cut it. Your Magic starter deck on Arena, that's not taking you very far if you're trying to climb the ladder or whatever. But Marvel Snap doesn't really have that problem the same way. Like your deck that you play Series 1, Series 2, like it's a fine deck for like you'll have to upgrade it with the new cards you get, but you're getting cards that are designed for that experience, right? Like your upgrade is going to be straightforward in a lot of cases. Eventually you get some agency introduced. You get to decide if you're an Odin or Spectrum deck or whatever.
Yeah.
And you can just kind of keep going, and that's a very satisfying experience for a very long time relative to what you're encountering around you. On the off chance you happen to make Infinite in your first month, that's going to be a bit of a different story, since Infinite like uncaps your opponent pool. But as long like if that doesn't happen, which it doesn't for the vast majority of people, like you're growing and your collection is growing kind of at the same pace as opponents' growth and collections. And there's some gap and catch up in Series 3, especially where like you'll start encountering people who are maybe farther ahead of you on either axis or both. But up until that point, it's pretty tight. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that really clicks for people and makes the game sticky and easy to grab onto and grow with. Like certainly it was for me when I first played the game. In beta, like I played, it was fine, and I just kept playing and kept adapting my deck, and I felt successful the whole time. I felt like I knew what was going on. I didn't feel, out of sorts. I felt it very much at home, and I think that's a difficult feeling to create in a CCG without creating like eventually some huge breakpoint where you're just like, oh, like I've been playing a totally different game this whole time. And even the gap between Series 2 and Series 3, like that's probably the biggest gap I would say is like right when you kind of translate into it, but it's still smaller than that like Magic Arena starter deck to standard deck. Like that gap is a chasm. And here it's like, no, you're like, 3 or 4 cards away from maybe being right back where you were. Like you just gotta
I do want to hold on. You say 3 or 4 cards, right? But I mean,
there's specific cards that may be difficult to find.
There's specific cards that may or may not cost 6,000 tokens, right? Like,
well, I'm speaking to the like Series 3 player versus Series 2 player. Like, so, but yes, like as you continue to graduate, like there's another gap. And like,
there's another deeper well that you sort of wander into. I remember that like 600 CL range being like the dead zone where like you didn't have anything, but all your opponents, and this wasn't me because I was the opponents who had everything. I was the opponents who had everything, but I was a lot of complaining about that. I remember when people were hitting that just after the token shop came out. I will say, I guess this is a good segue to a question I really wanted to ask that I think I know the answer to. You don't let pricing affect balance, correct?
I am not the team. The design team does not dictate like the series of a card. That's something like we consult on with our product team as to kind of what they would like to do. And we are experimenting with different things. Like obviously we've changed a lot about card acquisition over the course of the year. And I can't dive into like, what we've learned and all of that stuff. But we are constantly learning. We've still got a lot of things to try and work through and kind of understand how they affect what is most satisfying for players. So we're going to continue to do that. But yeah, like I don't design cards that way. We identify the cards that, design's process is we identify what the season's going to be about. We identify the characters we're going to design cards for. We start designing cards for those characters. Some number of months later, we show those cards to some other people, right? Like that's basically like our synopsized process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because like I was really intrigued by this season, right? Because the one card pretty much everyone agrees is like, okay, this card's going to be broken is Mobius, and he's at 3K, right? And when you look at the pricing on these cards, this season's cards, it seems to me as though, literally they just priced it based on what's cool. Like, what's the biggest, coolest thing? That's 6K. Who are the two little, like, humanoid guys who, like, have hate bear effects or whatever? Like, maybe little finicky things? Those are 3K. Like, that really struck me. I was like, oh, they're definitely not pricing on power here. They're doing, like, the opposite of that. They're pricing on splash.
I think that's a valid interpretation.
Glenn, what do you think about what is the power of an intellectual property like Marvel behind a game like Snap? How important is it for a new game to have an intellectual property like that? Because I'll be honest, I was not a fan of Marvel before Marvel Snap. It had no consideration to me playing the game, and it does not contribute to my enjoyment of the game. But I have noticed through YouTube comments, through friends, people like that there are people that were drawn to the game by Marvel, and some people that play it just to play characters that they like in Marvel. How important is it to a new game success to have a powerful IP? We're seeing tons of games do this, right? Disney Lorcana just came out, we One Piece, etc. We see big IPs being released behind these card games. Just talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting element of the market. It's kind of funny because I think it plays both ways, and I think even some of the examples you gave. So, like, it's nice to have an IP. Certainly, like, you get a built-in audience that you can cater your game towards, perhaps. But at the same time, you also maybe that's constraining on the game, right? Like, we can take Marvel Snap as a reasonable example. Like, Marvel's a really popular IP. If Marvel Snap was if Marvel Snap was what was it? Artifact. Like, if that was the structure of Marvel Snap, right? Like, that would just be a big miss. The Marvel audience isn't the I want to play 3 locations and this hyper complex game that's really got a ton of numbers and highly granular pieces. Like, that's the Marvel audience is the core mainstream consumer audience of America, right? They're the people who go to movies and watch Thor beat up whoever Thor's beating up in this movie. So, like, that speaks to why it's important Marvel Snap be a clean, accessible experience, because we want all of the people who can enjoy a Marvel movie to potentially be able to enjoy a Marvel Snap game. We want those audiences to line up. And I don't say that to, like, knock on Artifact. Like, what's Artifact's target audience, right? Like, the game didn't do very well, but its target audience was Dota players, right? Like, that is very much the kind of game that they want to play. So
they're psychos. Like, there's so much going on there.
I have a lot of great friends who play Dota. I don't personally play Dota, but that's the game. Like, it makes sense that you might target players that way, right? So Lorcana is kind of in an interesting case to me, because I feel like Lorcana was Marvel Snap was like a game in search of an IP, right? Like, kind of. It's, this highly accessible thing. There's got to be an IP that makes sense for it, and they happen to work together really well, and boom, fireworks. Again, I didn't work here during that time, but that's kind of how it seems like it went. But Lorcana is I feel like the opposite. Disney's got, Disney's like, hey, we've got Disney. Disney's great. We could really use a game, because that's like a market that we see there's a lot of success in. We'd like to, dip our toes and get something going over there so that people can learn and enjoy Disney in a totally different place. We already know that they enjoy Disney. We just want to give them one more place to do it. Which, to be fair, maybe that was even, how Marvel kind of approached the relationship with Second Dinner. I don't know. But that's kind of what I see as that. So in that case, like, the game is often born from the interest when that's the case, right? Like, it's kind of a chicken and the egg kind of conversation. Like, I think in Lorcana's case, my assumption is Disney came first, game came second, right? But that's not necessarily true of all games. And the IP gives you a built-in audience, but it can be constraining. The bigger factor, I think, is, like, if you're not going to have an IP, a built-in audience of some kind, you got to have some other plan for creating that audience, or covering that audience disparity. Which maybe that's just, you spend an extra several $1 million on marketing or advertising. Like, that might be the solution to your problem, right? Maybe that's you charge up front for the game instead of trying to do, like, DLC. Maybe it means you do both. Like, I think we see that with stuff. What's another, like, Overwatch is like a fine example, right? Like, that's a game that came from a totally new IP, essentially. And, they pushed, how did they push on Overwatch?
Was it before?
I know it has a little bit of a history, but for players, it was largely new. But what was their strategy when bringing that to market, right? Like, they have these cinematics to introduce you to the characters. Characters have super differing silhouettes. They're identifiable at a glance. They do skins, but that they can do skins because the silhouettes are so different. And how do you where did they learn that kind of thing from? Like, you go back into other games, like League of Legends did that very well. Like, so I think you can definitely succeed without an IP. But I do think an IP lets you maybe redirect attention elsewhere, maybe comes at a cost of how you have to build your game. And in some cases, that constraint's great. Like, I would argue that for Marvel Snap, the fact that, Marvel being a property that's key and awesome to be like really accessible for players leads to creating a really accessible game. And I think that's where a ton of Marvel Snap success is from, is being an accessible game.
To what degree is Blizzard its own IP? Like, the fact that Overwatch is a Blizzard game, to what degree, like, if you, I would say, as Second Dinner, you had this game, you knew it was awesome, but you weren't able to land a deal with Marvel, like, that would, like, you talked about the fireworks, both parts are required, right? So if you're a smaller studio,
I can't speak to that since this is the first small studio I've been a part of.
Sure.
So it's a little trickier for me to have an educated opinion on it, especially when I wasn't here for the history of this particular one. But yeah, like, I would say Blizzard is a brand more so than maybe an intellectual property, just a subtle distinction I would say to make. But yeah, like, a Blizzard game, you know what you're kind of getting from a Blizzard game. Like, there are elements of Blizzard games that kind of run through, like, a Blizzard customer can trust that they'll kind of get a certain experience within a spectrum. But one part of that experience is, like, there will be some kind of narrative cohesion. Like, and the narrative cohesion of World of Warcraft and StarCraft and Overwatch are very, and I assume Valorant, I've never actually played Valorant, are very different. But they have some similar ideals that have demonstrated, like, Blizzard knows this is how we communicate these individual intellectual properties within the language of our brand.
Mm-hmm. All right, Glenn, I want to ask you a bit of a personal question of mine, not a personal question for you, but I'm going to make an assumption that you existed in the 90s. So the 90s was known for a bit of a TCG Renaissance, as it could be called. There was a lot of TCGs coming out for better and for worse. That cycle seems to be cyclical and seems to be happening again right now, right? We see so many trading card games coming out, so many new IPs, big IPs, but also independent IPs, things like Grand Archive, Algomancy, a million Kickstarters, Sorcery, etc. Just as a person who may have sort of experienced that the last time that happened, can you just talk to me a little bit about what's going on right now with all these card games coming out and just your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty different Renaissance from the last one, mostly because of two things. I think one is the existence of the digital world is, like, totally different. And the other is possibly a biased opinion, but is Magic, and specifically is Magic becoming $1 billion brand. I think that really, those words changed the understanding of a lot of businesses. Wizards became a $1 billion company, like, a couple of years ago, or I don't know.
Right, it was. Is that like the main driver there? Is that what we're talking about?
Magic is the vast majority of Wizards' revenue, and it's the largest, I believe, the largest source of revenue in, like, all of Hasbro by, like, a meaningful factor. So yeah, it's a big thing in a way that it was not when all of that stuff happened before. Like, Magic's, like, you can just look at the number of products Magic makes. Like, Magic, from when I was hired at Wizards to now, makes easily twice as many new cards a year, right? Like, easily. And the value of the company and the number of employees changed somewhat commensurately, right? So I think that's what people are seeing, and I can, like, that's obviously, like, only my perspective, but I think that makes sense. Like, I think that's part of what maybe drove Disney towards Lorcana, right? As they see, like, oh, like, this is something, like, Disney wasn't coming around to build, like, the next, I don't mean it disparagingly at all, but I mean, like, Disney isn't like, we need flesh and blood, right? Like, no, Disney's like, we want.
Let's be honest.
We want $1 billion brand.
I mean it disparagingly.
No, if it didn't say Disney on the box, honestly, it would have been a hard sell if it didn't have Disney on the box.
It's actually very funny when you look at the design of Lorcana.
I haven't actually played the game at all. I just kind of, like, read the rules, and I was like, okay, it's kind of like Duel Masters, basically, or Kaishudo, it seems like. But yeah, that's what got Disney interested. I would assume. I don't know. I don't speak to anybody at Disney. At least that I know. So that's the kind of thing. But I have had, like I've had hedge fund managers like reach out to me on LinkedIn to be like, hey, like, could you talk to us about TCGs? Like, we want to know how they work. Like that's an experience that I'd never had before, and it I think it correlates to a pretty specific point in time. So I think that's one thing that's going on. And the other is, like the digital space. Like, you don't have to spend money to print cards anymore, right? Like, you can just put them on a digital space. Like, that's a huge thing. Like, that's one of the things, like, Magic's still dealing with that even now. There are complications from having to manage relationships with all of the people the vendors who create Magic cards. Like, that's a meaningful constraint on exactly what Magic does, is the fact that they have to print them in paper and sell them in booster packs. Pokemon is similarly constrained. Like, Pokemon has a pretty great digital app. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the app is actually structured in such a way that you buy real life paper cards and redeem it into the app. Like, that's something that no new game would do, right? Like, there's just no reason to have that. But Pokemon didn't come from a new game. It came from Pokemon. So it needs that. So that's why I think those are the two things I think are really basically, it's like kind of the California Gold Rush or whatever, somebody has hit, like, everybody wants to get in again. And that was what happened way back when. Like, that was why we saw that first Renaissance, was like Yu-Gi-Oh following up on Magic, and then Pokemon, like, those were like big hits. Like, people were like, okay, they're like, let's go for it. Even Wizards did that. Wizards launched a bunch of card games. So.
And that's why you're the reigning, world champion runner-up of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Show card game.
Yes, it is.
I think that it's, honestly, I do think that Magic being a billion-dollar company, Wizards being a billion-dollar company, is a big part of it. But I think, a lot of what's leading to so many card games now is actually, like, some of the smaller publishers, like, every single TCG Kickstarter I see is $500,000, $1 million, $250,000 for, a draft board game like Algamancy just came out. Caleb Ganny does Cube for Magic. He raised like almost $500,000. Like, it's incredible. I wonder the sustainability of sort of how frequently we're getting them because of consumer fatigue. How many TCGs can a consumer play? Because TCGs are fundamentally, in terms of how you acquire a collection, a very, very inefficient board game. And I do wonder, how many can come onto the market before we sort of repeat the cycle that we saw back in the 90s, which is, not all of them survive.
Yeah, I think that's definitely just going to happen. Like, I would not go work on like those other games. Like, if it were my decision, like I'm obviously making decisions for my career or whatever, but like if I wanted to work on a paper TCG, like it would just be Magic. That's where I would be working. So like these other games like do some interesting stuff. I think there's a ton of things to learn from, but ultimately it just seems so likely to me that like the ultimate outcome for tons of paper-based card games is they are successful for some number of months or years, and then the coolest stuff from their game design gets incorporated into Magic one day, and that's kind of how it goes. Maybe that's not how it goes. I mean, eventually somebody theoretically is going to change that paradigm, but that's just been what's happened for decades now at this point. And we see kind of the reverse too. Like, I think Flesh and Blood is a good example in that it's in some ways like a reaction to the success of Magic's Commander format. So I think that's what, of all the games, I think that's what Flesh and Blood most closely feels like an analog to, is literally Magic as Commander. It's not Magic as Magic, right? Like, it's different. And even that format is totally like based on other stuff. Like, that format reminds me of some ways of like Dragon Ball Z even. So
yeah, I think Flesh and Blood is closer to a fighting game rather than any other card game. It also capitalized off of the announcement that Magic was suspending its Pro Tour, and it came out and it was like boom, $1 million Pro Tour, right? So I think that really helped out Flesh and Blood. But it's really interesting when we talk about Commander and Magic. Magic being a game that has survived and sort of flourished for so long and somewhat off the back of the Commander format. I see a lot of these new games coming out now, and they try to implement a Commander format into their game, and it's consistently unsuccessful, right? Like, this multiplayer format that has somewhat propped up Magic seems to be so serendipitous, and it's like I don't see any other publishers being able to capture the essence of what is Commander, because it's much more than just a multiplayer card format with your friends. I just want to get your thoughts on Commander and the success of that format.
I do think it's been captured again in different places, but it's kind of tricky to see. The examples I'll use, I think probably the biggest / most successful one I would say is probably Slay the Spire. Like, Slay the Spire doesn't have like the breadth of commandership in it, but like it's still like, you choose your identity. Like, I'm going to be the fighter, I'm going to be the whatever. And you go through and build your deck and like have this journey. And that's what is at the like core essence of Commander, is like, I'm going to limit what I'm able to do to what correctly expresses this character. And then from there, it can get like totally wild. Like, you know, competitive Commander is obviously like, no, that character doesn't matter. I'm blue. I'm going to do all the broken blue stuff. That's a totally different thing. But it is still restricted in some ways to a choice. Like, I made a choice that's going to limit what I can do, and then I'm going to go from there to expand it. So I think that, and I think like that's the kind of choice Flesh and Blood has, that is a really elegant and a choice that makes a lot of sense and has a lot of good flavor in that game, from my understanding of it. I've played like the starter decks a few times, basically.
So do you think the Commander is hinged off of player identity, players empathizing with a specific deck, and then being able to engage with that with their friends?
That's what I think is the lesson that games should be taking away from Commander, and I think many have, is that the thing a Commander does most well is creates this piece of identity a player can tie themselves to in their deck. Like, I don't have a red-white deck, you know, I have an Aurelia deck. Like, I like Aurelia. I don't like Cole or whoever else like that. You know, that's really important. That's a meaningful thing that lots of games didn't necessarily have, even though they're great games. Can take a look back, like I mentioned Slay, like, you know, look at stuff like Dominion or Ascension. Like, you're not a character in those games, at least not in the early ones. Ascension actually had an expansion somewhat later on where you kind of were a character, which is cool. And then they came out with Ascension Tactics, like, I don't know, 2 years ago, which is very much in that space. So yeah, that's what I think the Commander format has really taught as the most successful learning from game design, is really, you know, tie people into what they're doing. Like, and that's what made Magic successful in the first place too. Was Magic, you know, you were a red white deck at first, like that was like, I like red and white, I'm a red white player, and now you get to be more specific and isolate that and distill it further into a different ideological space. So I think that that's really awesome, and the people who came up with the Commander format, which, unlike so many other things in games, like, that is a fan created thing. Like, I think that's true of like Dota as well, right? Like, Dota is a kind of fan origin thing. Yeah. So those are two kind of like titans of gaming, in that sense, that things that came from players and ultimately are like changing the paradigm of the industry and their specific genres. Yeah.
I as a dedicated Sunglasses of Arza main, I am a big fan of red-white combos here. Did I just drop a reference to a Magic card you didn't get, or did you get that one?
I don't remember what Sunglasses of Urza does specifically, but I do know
it lets exists. You tap. I think what it is it lets you tap for either red or white, if I recall correctly. It's like it's like the worst.
Sound right, but
let me Google it. I was pretty sure. Yeah. You may spend white mana as though it were red mana.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Dedicated Sunglasses of Urza main. They are some absolutely incredible sunglasses, by the way. Absolutely phenomenal. I don't know what they were thinking when they made that card, but it's one of the, like, I remember it 2 decades later, right? So there is that to be said for Sunglasses of Urza. But
the power of story.
The power of incredibly cool lenses. Like, have you seen them? Seriously, go look them up. They look amazing. I want them in real life. They're phenomenal. They would look incredible on me. I did have one. Brendan got to ask you the personal question. I've got a personal question. As someone who has made no secret of my ambitions at some point to try my hand at design development, what is the number one thing I should be doing that I'm currently not doing?
Well, I can't speak super well to what you're currently not doing, but I can tell you what I consider like some of the things that have differentiated me in my career over time.
Okay.
Which I think in general are kind of differing markers between like junior designers and more senior designers. The first is ties into a lot of the stuff we talked about earlier in the podcast, which is like, you are making a product for consumers. Like, nobody is coming to the supermarket and being like, where's the aisle for balanced games? Right? Like, that's not what they ask. Like, they're looking for content or an experience, and they want it to be balanced. Like, imbalance can make their content or experience not as good. But that's not necessarily like balance balance doesn't necessarily mean like perfect balance, right? Like the imperfect balance is the most fun thing in games. Like League and Snap are two games that are imperfectly balanced, and they exist in that spectrum. Like that's just how things work. Is that the games shift and change, and different things are good at different times, and some things are too good for too long, or whatever. It happens. So imperfect balance is better than perfect balance. Chess is, not literal perfectly balanced, but a fine example of like a super balanced game. But is chess like exciting? For some people, yes, but I would say by and large, the average consumer is not like finding chess exciting by their conventional definition of exciting. So that's probably the biggest one. Is just like you are making a product, and you have to learn to think about it in that lens. Related to that lens is you are making a product for lots of different people. So like some people are supposed to like some stuff and hate other stuff. If they liked everything, then you're doing it wrong, because you're missing out on space that you could be mining. Mark Rosewater has a great design talk. Honestly, if you want to become a game designer, I would also encourage you to just read tons of Mark Rosewater. He has been giving the best free course on game design for like decades now, in his weekly column. It is so long and spanning, it's difficult for me to even find the columns that I would recommend. But he did a GDC talk that is, I believe, freely available on YouTube. That's like 20 years, 20 lessons. Great talk. If you're interested in game design, strongly recommend it. In general, GDC talks are awesome to listen to anyway. If you actually wanted a list of some I recommend, I can send you that later. Because I do keep that list. Yeah. But one of the things Mark calls out in that talk is, like, you don't want people, you would rather people like love and hate. Like, those are strong emotions. You want strong emotions around your game. Like, if people don't care, then they don't care. the game is just not that important to them. So that's whenever I, am bombarded by people who are frustrated on Discord or Twitter, like, I keep that in mind. It's like, all it tells me is that this person cares a lot about my game, and that's just a better reason for me to continue being a good steward of the game and making the best decisions I can. So those are, I think, like two pretty big lessons are like, just holding on to it's a product and holding on to learning to look at it from all of the lenses that players can perceive it by. But also you have to be objective about that. You can't, like, sometimes players are right for sure, but more often players, when someone says I'm having a bad experience, they definitely know that that's true. You should listen to that. When they tell you why they're having a bad experience, they might not have that right. Like, that's tricky space to navigate. You may not always know exactly what's going on there.
No, I'm a big believer that, like, for most people, they're not able to look beyond I lost and this sucks, or I won and this is awesome. And there's a great, I struggle with that plenty.
There's a great game design quote. I forget who said it, but it's something like, when it's not a problem if paper is better, like if paper is the best thing in your game, like that's not a problem. But when paper doesn't like beating rock, that's a problem. Like when the best thing is bad, or like when being the best thing is unfun. Like that's another good one that I've always kept in mind for player perspective.
That resonates.
Can you? This is something I've heard. I don't know if it's apocryphal. Maybe you'll be able to confirm, deny. But like in Magic Arena, there's like a little "Did you enjoy this?" Experience, smiley face, unsmiley face thing. I have heard that the biggest determinant of that is just whoever won. They're clicking the smiley face a lot more than anything else. Is that in line with your experience? Can you confirm / deny on that?
I would assume that is true, that is a large bias in that sample, but it's also an easy bias to correct. You just set each sample against the win-loss result when you're cross-referencing, and then you can kind of get an idea of like, okay, what else might have happened that was frustrating.
This is crazy. I feel like we could talk for literally 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. Like, I feel like we could just keep going. It's actually killing me that we have like a normal podcast that we can't go 8 hours on. Glenn, I have a question for you. Follow up. Would you be willing to come back on?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that sometime.
Because like it feels like there's so much depth here, and we like covered. It almost feels like what we covered today is like the intro. Does that make sense? Do you feel that way, Brendan?
Sure.
Is it just me?
Lots of knowledge. I mean, Glenn, generally, it's really interesting talking to people like yourself. I mean, you have, what I could only articulate as a lot of wisdom when it comes to card design, card games, the history of them, and I believe the future as well. And that's why it's so interesting to talk to you, is because we look at you look at Marvel Snap, you take it in such a if you look at it alone, you take it in such a small sort of a vacuum, right? But it's not. It's the I don't know. It's the accumulation of just years and years of experience, and that's sort of what has led to us playing such a good game. And like, you know, talking to someone like yourself, we kind of get to pull back the curtain and see the mind behind what creates an experience like that. And it's, I don't know, genuinely, it's fascinating. Honestly, I'll tell you that in one of your, while you were talking, you actually answered a question that I've been asking myself about Flesh and Blood for a few years now. And it's like, what has detracted away from the enjoyment of Flesh and Blood as we've progressed through the years? And I've had players come up to me. I was previously at US Nationals in Las Vegas about 3 weeks ago, and they would complain to me. I would say, but why do you think that? I mean, we look at the meta, the meta pie of decks that are playable is so much more diverse than it's ever been. You know, many different decks are winning events. It feels like you can play any deck that you want to, and not be sort of, you know, inting before you get to the tournament. So why do you not enjoy this aspect? And I think what it came down to is, as some of the more powerful heroes and strategies rotated out of Flesh and Blood, the decks lost their sort of identity. Like, the people that used to play chain are no longer chain players, and the decks have become more homogenous and more mid-rangey, and it's been a bit samey. Like, there are multiple aggro decks, yes, but they kind of feel and do the same thing. And I think that the identity behind some of the decks in Flesh and Blood, and what made it so popular and so fun and so unique in the beginning, has been lost a bit to balance. But it's hard for me to evaluate, because I think I have a strong bias towards the nostalgic experience that I had 2 to 3 years ago playing the game. But I had so many people come up to me during the week, and they're like, "Oh, I hate this meta." I'm like, how could you say that? I mean, we look at the meta, the statistics, they're fantastic. You know, it's great. But there's just something about, I think, what was core to the essence of Flesh and Blood that has started to sort of, I don't know, go away as, you know, internal mechanisms through Living Legend, which is a rotation of heroes that occurs based off points that are won at tournaments, so it's self-correcting, and through design, not trying to push design, because, you know, some of these older heroes are a bit crazy. Like, there were heroes that could necropotence their whole entire deck. You know, there were heroes that fundamentally didn't interact, and, you know, they weren't necessarily healthy for the game, but they did have a very, very strong identity.
Yeah, I don't know.
Flesh and Blood on a stick.
Oh yeah.
Yu Yu Hakusho had Future Sight on a stick, so yeah, and Yogswill on a stick. That was a fun game.
Nice. That's awesome.
So yeah. I don't know Flesh and Blood well enough to speak to that example, but I do know that exactly is what happened to Legends of Runeterra a while ago. And they had to correct for it. They had been balancing the game for I don't know how long exactly, like a couple years maybe at some point. And then they wound up doing a large rebalance because they realized so much of what they had done had been like, you know, the core spell cards for like Deny, and I think Molten Rain was one. Like, they had been nerfing these cards, and it had gotten to the point where it was muddying the identity of like what each faction was supposed to be good at. Where it's like, well, if you're nerfing all of Bilgewater's like go wide burn spells, then Bilgewater's not the go wide burn faction, right? Like it's much closer to whoever's second place. So you got to restore the disparity, because that's your color pie. Like, you need some kind of distinction between them to be loud and pronounced, and you got to find another way to address the imbalance. It can't just be like nerfing all of the things that give the faction its identity. Yeah. And I thought that was one of the most interesting changes they had to make, because it was a pretty significant list of balance updates, and most of it was just change the card back to how it was in a lot of spots. And I thought that was super fascinating. Like, that was a learning moment for me as a game designer, to like see what had happened to their game and like think it through critically and be like, oh, okay, like, yeah, good to know. I will keep that in mind for the future.
As an aggro gamer, like, that's just in games where that is a thing, that's what I play, right? Like, that's what I like doing. I like putting the pressure on. That's how I like to play. One of the things I've noticed about Marvel Snap is it feels like there's not a lot of ways to actually do that. Like,
yeah,
what would you have for someone like me who's like, you know, if I took one of those, every time I take one of those Magic color quizzes, it's like red, and then if they get a little bit more dynamic, it's like teamer, right? And so, but like primary in red there, right? What is there for me if I like doing that, other than, you know, the entire game, because it's very fast?
Yeah, I think that's where it appeals to you most. So it's interesting because Magic has a color pie, and I've had to adapt that to different IPs a few times. But Snap does not have a color pie per se. Like, there are some themes, like the spider people moving or whatever, but I wouldn't say that's a color pie, because the difference between a theme and a color pie is that the color pie is like a mechanical foundation of your game. It's how you create distinction and balance and disparity to make sure that everything is good. So like the closest thing Snap has to a color pie is like, you know, Shang-Chi, Iron Man, Hulk, or whatever, like in early series, where it was like kind of this rock paper scissors situation, right? Like that's the closest thing that's really there, is how those elements kind of intersect into what's stronger versus whatever else. So Snap just doesn't really have a color palette. They have themes that you can enjoy and identify with. But it does have the psychographics, which were first proposed by a guy named Bartle, I think. And then Mark Rosewater has the version that Magic uses that has become much more popular, which is like Spike, Timmy, Johnny, and then Mary would be the fourth one. I don't recall. I think Mark believes something different about Mary, but I believe in Mary. We'll say it that way. And those are, Spike is winning is what matters most to me. Timmy is doing something big and spectacular is what matters most to me. Johnny is doing something clever is what matters most to me. And Mary is more about like the connection of playing a game with someone. Like how are we? It's the social gamer, which is what Commander caters really strongly to. And I forget Bartle's specific taxonomy. He uses something like killer, achiever, something else. So a little less friendly than Timmy and Spike and whatnot. So yeah, like that's what I think Snap does have in spades. Like if you want to do like Living Tribunal, like that's Timmy gaming right there.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just gonna make this huge number. Wong Odin is even more. That's Timmy gaming too. And then there's all kinds of like Johnny is kind of woven into a lot of different little weird spots. But like I put a Johnny deck out this week on Twitter. My Jane Foster
you think that's
Yellow
a Johnny
Jacket
deck?
Wasp deck. I think that's a Johnny deck.
Really?
Like it has Timmy moments in that you're like, making a big hit monkey or whatever, but like the Johnny element is like, how do I make Jane Foster like this thing? Like I want it to be like a linchpin.
Interesting.
I'm building a deck around Jane Foster. That's what I think. Like that's why I think it's more of a Johnny deck than a Timmy deck.
Galactus
it has
Johnny deck.
Everything.
No,
everything
like a
bleeds
Johnny
over.
deck is like every Arnim Zola deck ever made.
Yeah, that's a good one too, I think. But those also have Timmy elements too. Like a 24 power Venom or a 30 power. Those are Timmy. So like a lot of this. That's what I think is really cool about Marvel Snap is like there's so much bleed among the psychographics, and Magic has that too. But I don't think quite as often as Marvel Snap does, or at least as loud. Like mono red. Like there aren't a lot of mono red Johnnies, right? Like that's just not a thing that like is enabled very often. There's some. Like it's not never around. But yeah, like that's a difference is that like Magic's archetypes tend to like really isolate towards like single psychographics a little more often. And I think Snap doesn't. Like I think Snap is incorporating two a ton of the time.
I mean, you can mono red Johnny and Commander for sure.
You can, yeah. I don't think any combination's like impossible at all. I was just like with Snap, like that what you said with Arnim Zola, like it's incidentally there, right? If you want to be an Arnim Zola Johnny gamer, you're gonna also be an Arnim Zola Timmy gamer. Like that, you can't do one without the other very easily.
I will say, because like one of the cards I always wished was a card I could actually play was Crystal, right? Because the first thing I thought when I looked at Crystal was like, oh my god, I'm going to get so far ahead and then I'm going to play Crystal and I'm going to refill my hand. It's going to be the coolest thing. This is back when she drew 3, refilled 3. And that entire style of gameplay just kind of isn't a thing in Snap because of the constraints of board space. And it's such an odd thing because like that's what I want to do. Like there's nothing for me as that style of player where it's like, all right, I want to get really ahead and slam the door, right? And in Snap, I have to do like a bunch of other things in order to do that, you know? So it's definitely like it's been an interesting experience for me as someone who, like, the way I thrive is put pressure on, make them make mistakes. And in Snap, that's a very different thing.
Yeah. It is really funny to me because I see so much archetype description that doesn't like line up with what I would personally do, but people bring whatever language in they have. So I see people talk about like aggro or control and Snap, and I'm just like, I don't even. What are you?
I don't think that's
about?
real. But, like, I've been thinking about this for a while. Like, I don't think that's real. There's no aggro because aggro is fundamentally about reducing your opponent's life total to 0 in a game with no life totals. Like, that's not real. There is combo.
Yeah,
but there is
point slam, combo, location, control, or denial.
Yeah, it's like that, right?
If
like
I was going to describe, like, it's funny, if I was trying to define what I thought an aggro deck would do in Snap, it would be like present a strong card early and snap. Like that's like like that's the closest thing to like shortening the span of the game, right? I'm gonna make you make a high intensity decision before you have enough information to know what's gonna happen. It's the equivalent of like if you could snap while playing Magic on like turn 3. It's like, do you have a Wrath of God in your hand or not? Like, are you willing to chance it? Like, you know, like that's the vibe you would want to try and create if you were trying to be an aggro deck and snap. But it's difficult because a lot of decks can snap very early on if they want to. Like, you know, you don't have to be planning to. A lot of decks can just decide to do that. Like,
I just want to lightning bolt people, Glenn. Let me lightning bolt people.
Snapping
maybe in the next game.
Snapping is such
a way to do that.
Like the concept of snapping in a card game is such such an interesting dynamic that like obviously it's core to Marvel Snap and sort of the crux of the game, but I honestly I have played other games since playing Marvel Snap, and I've played them online, whether it be Hearthstone or Disney Lorcana sort of emulator, and not having the ability to snap feels foreign in a card game now, especially a digital card game. It being able to increase the stakes off of a sort of non-deterministic future or semi-deterministic future is just like part of what is card gaming to me at this point. Glenn, I want to ask you a question, which I think I'm vicariously asking for someone else, but it came up on a previous podcast we have. If someone wants to become a game designer, but they have no experience and they're looking to get their start, they have no portfolio, how do you make that first step? Because that seems to be the hardest. It seems like once you get your foot in the door, you know, you can develop a portfolio, you can work for a few years, and that will, you know, there's a ladder there. But the initial sort of gig, getting into it the first time, how does someone make that jump? Because a lot of players, you know, do aspire to become game designers.
Yeah, my answer is kind of funny because I actually kind of hate college as a principal. That's a whole other podcast topic. But I'm not a big fan of how college is structured in America. But I do think that actually game design is one, like that instruction is one of the better ways to get into game design. Not just because you get like a piece of paper that tells people, you know, how to go to class or whatever. But like you learn language, like the language that you need to speak in, like being able to talk about like, you know, the atom of a game or like top down design versus bottom up design, like that kind of stuff. Like you will learn that stuff, and that's important. But also game design courses, at least good ones, in my opinion, will give you the tools you need to make a game, which is ultimately like going to be the best thing you could do for trying to get your foot in the door, is to have something you can point at to show people like this. I made this. I understand how this works. You can ask me about this and I can tell you about it. I can tell you what mistakes I made. I can tell you what I would do better next time. Like that kind of stuff. That's all like really important to be able to build confidence in a game designer in an interview. Because that's another thing, is like becoming a game designer isn't just about like, you know, having these skills. It's actually about passing an interview or a number of interviews. Like every job is like that. But at least most jobs are like that. But people don't really necessarily think of them as that kind of a game. But that's what getting a job is. It's a game, and the interview is one of the levels, right? Like you have to learn how to play the interview level. So that's what I would say is the biggest tool in game design, is like doing some kind of instruction. It doesn't have to be, you know, you go to college and get a BA in game design. I do think that's probably a waste of your time and money. But I do think like taking a course on game design, you know, like a single certificate or like a 10-week thing, or going to GDC even for, you know, a year or something like that. Like that, those kinds of things do pay off. Like they give you connections and they give you the opportunity to learn and to give you the tools in many cases to make your own game. I will say like that's making your own game, huge undertaking and an endeavor, but worth doing. Even if you can't necessarily make a full game, doing a lot of the steps, like building a game design document, coming up with a pitch that you might give a publisher on your game, like building a prototype or a paper demo of some kind. Like all of these are useful things that you can talk about in an interview, which again, like that's the actual kind of weird key to becoming a game designer, is being good at doing game design interviews and design tests, which are another, usually a level before the design interview. But you're really trying to think about getting the job as a game unto itself, and what are the things you can equip your character with that will get you through each of those levels. And I think that game design instruction, even though again, I'm not a big fan of college in general, is actually oddly enough a pretty good investment right now if you're finding like a good program that's a good value and will give you the skills that you need.
Yeah. I think having that portfolio, you know, even if you don't have a professional portfolio yet, but having something you can point towards that you've worked on, whether it's a side project or, you know, whatever, that helps a lot, because it's a reference point that you can sort of continue the conversation with, and something that people can point to, that you have some sort of experience here. Because I think that's the hardest part, is people look at the process and they assume that they're going to go from nothing or being in a vacuum to a game design interview with no reference material. It's important to have that reference point, I think.
Yeah, and there's also there are game designers, and then there are like specific game designers, like say, we've hired for the Snap team or reviewed people, and one of the things I make sure to kind of think through is is this person a designer for whatever they worked on before, or are they a game designer? Like, can they translate those skills to these other areas, to these other things? Because Magic is famous for hiring professional Magic players internally into Magic R&D. Well, yeah. Yeah, and that's worked out. Many of those people are awesome at their job. I love so many of those people. I would even go so far as to say I probably would not have become a game designer at Wizards if it weren't for the fact that I had a minor competitive background. That was a factor in hiring me. That was considered a benefit. But also, while they're there, that's on them to continue to add skills if they want to be able to design games other than Magic. You're not going to just be a professional Magic player, work on Magic games, for forever, and then be able to, go out and design the next, tabletop RPG or massive multiplayer online game. That's not how it works, right? You have to actually continue your own education and build skills. So that is another way you can do it, is finding a game that hires its players or hires people who have been successful within it in another way. And that gives you that launching pad to do it. Because that's certainly how it worked out for me. I did not go to a game design course until I was a game designer. But I was a game designer, and I went to an introductory game design certificate, and I got that certificate because I was I want to make sure I'm going to be as good at this as I can be. I want to further my education.
Mm-hmm. Hit me up if y'all ever decide to start doing that.
Doing what?
If y'all ever decide to start bringing in players as balance people, if that ever happens in Snap, hit me up. Hit my DMs. That's my pitch. All right. This has been unbelievable. Brendan, do you have anything else on a list?
No, I just have to thank Glenn for being. I have to thank you, Glenn, for being so generous with your time, on the podcast. And I think that you're a tremendous ambassador for the game, and that Second Dinner is lucky to have you, that you can sort of articulate, the design process over to us as players. It only boosts our confidence in the game and makes us just love it even more. So I really appreciate you coming on the.
Thanks. It was a good time.
Yeah, I came into this podcast having just lost a couple 8-cubers. I was mad. and now at the end of the podcast, I'm like, man, I'm so grateful I'm in a position to do this. My rank doesn't matter. I'll be fine. And that's a rare thing to induce in me, normally I do not feel like that. I do not feel like that. Normally I'm like, all right, if I lose rank, no one will ever listen to me again. But I came away from this being I'm just really lucky to be able to have the opportunity to do what I'm doing right now. And thanks, Glenn, for, I guess, inducing that feeling in me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And belated congrats on going full-time for content too. So
yeah, we'll see about that. I mean, it has been the wildest ride of my life, and it has been under a month. It is crazy. It is crazy out here. Thank you so much, Glenn. I really appreciate you coming on, and I cannot wait to have you back on.
All right, everybody. Cool. For Twitter's got at BrendanAPG, at Glenn GLENN _Jones _ at KMBest MS. A video version of this on YouTube at youtube.com/the_snapshot. Like and subscribe while you're there. KM, anything to plug in regards to Twitch before we close it out?
Watch my stream, subscribe to my stream, watch my YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube. No, for real. I'm streaming pretty much every day at this point, 6 p.m. I did take a break because I did an 8-hour ladder stream. So there is a day off in there. I apologize. I don't apologize. I did an 8-hour ladder stream. You got exactly the amount of KM content. It was just front loaded instead of evenly distributed. Every day, 6 p.m. KM Best MS on Twitch. Highlights and deck guides on YouTube, and of course some special commentary things that I've been doing on YouTube as well. Thank you so much for everything all of you have done.
Yep. Thank you all so much for listening. We'll see you next week.